This is Football at 4.
Football at 4, powered by the Inside the Birds podcast, InsideTheBirds.com. And, of course, as it is each and every day here on the Sports Bash, brought to you by Bet365. Whatever the sport, whatever the moment, it's never ordinary at Bet365. Joining us, as is each and every Monday for a Mosher Monday, Geoff Mosher, Inside the Birds, the podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, also Inside the Birds on YouTube, InsideTheBirds.com, and Geoff P. Mosher on the Twitter X platform. Geoff, how you doing on this Monday?
I'm great, Josh. How are you?
Doing well, and I thought it was interesting because, listening to that, that canned Jeffrey Lurie audio coming into your segment, it kind of lines up with some of the things that Howie Roseman was saying to the media today down in Orlando, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it. Howie basically presented some of the moves they made this offseason, like trading for Pickett, like adding Saquon Barkley. He's trying to paint them as, well, this is who we are. These are the kind of, decisions we make when it comes to players who have talent. Do you buy that theory from Howie, that this kind of goes in line with what they've done in the past?
No, it definitely goes in line with when Howie sees as an opportunity to get a playmaker. In his past, he has done that. A.J. Brown's a really good example of that, right? But, he said that there was an inaccurate portrayal of his philosophy of running back because, as he said, he paid LaShawn McCoy. He was part of the front office that paid Brian Westbrook later in his career to a bigger deal. But those are, to me, that's a little bit apples to oranges. Both of those guys, Westbrook and McCoy, were in-house guys. They were there. And, usually when you have the opportunity to give an extension in-house, it winds up being a little bit more team-friendly. No one has ever said the Eagles don't like to extend their own guys. And obviously there's the exception of Christian McCaffrey, who we know the Eagles would have drafted had they been able to many years ago. But again, you're getting a guy who's cost-controlled on a long-term deal, even if he's a top 10 pick. It is a little out of character for him to spend this kind of money on a running back. There have been countless running backs who have been available in free agency since LaShawn McCoy, right? Who Howie Roseman has not put money into, despite that running back could have been a good fit for the Eagles. So this is a unique situation. Definitely falls more in line with his desire of getting a playmaker. And as we reported on Inside the Birds, Saquon Barkley was a guy that Howie Roseman really liked coming out of Penn State years ago and just never had an opportunity to draft. So you can throw Kenny Pickett in that same boat, a guy that Howie Roseman liked years ago, never had an opportunity in the draft, but now he had an opportunity to get them, so he did.
Before we get to Pickett, I just want to one more on Barkley, and that is because you mentioned how he was a guy the Eagles liked coming out of college, and you mentioned about how you and Adam have reported numerous times about the Christian McCaffrey thing. If the Eagles would have gotten one of those kind of running backs earlier, if let's say McCaffrey would have fallen to them, or maybe a Barkley would have fallen to them, how much different do you think this team would look today?
It's a good question. Like you can even throw in the example, what if Miles Sanders had just been a little bit more well-rounded for them? What if he had been a better catcher of the football? What if he had stayed healthy? What if he had had more years for the Eagles, like his final year, where he had a career best rushing year? How would that have looked? Well, it probably would have meant that the Eagles would have given him an extension after year 3 like they did with LaShawn McCoy. So whether it would be Barkley, right, or the year later Miles Sanders coming out and being that 3-down playmaker that they really liked coming out of Penn State when they drafted Miles Sanders in the second round, then the offense would look a little bit different, you would imagine, because they would have paid a guy like that. I don't think the Eagles have ever been in the business of just drafting a guy for 4 years. They want high picks to get second contracts, but those guys have to warrant it.
Geoff, flipping it over to the Pickett side of it, because, Howie did talk about him as well. And, we have joked in the past bringing up, Howie in the quarterback factory. But, he did mention about what I thought was interesting about how, Kenny Pickett is a guy who has talent, and they believe in building depth at that position. And to me, the reason why the Kenny Pickett thing makes sense, Geoff, is because if the Eagles didn't have this quarterback philosophy, they don't draft Jalen Hurts in 2020, right? If they didn't have this philosophy, they don't bring back Nick Foles for the 2017 season. They don't bring in Michael Vick when Donovan McNabb is still here. So I get where he's coming from on the Pickett thing. I don't think the Pickett move is that extreme at all.
No, I wouldn't say it's extreme. Philosophically, as you just mentioned, Josh, it aligns with what they like to do, which is find young quarterbacks in any capacity and see if there's something to get there from him. And they obviously like Kenny Pickett coming out of Pitt, and now they have a chance to bring him in, and it's 2 years, and it's way cheaper. By the way, that's a big part of their philosophy, too, is that there's been a rising cost of backup quarterbacks. They had to pay Marcus Mariota last year $5 million to play, I don't know, what he played, 20 snaps, right?
Right.
But where I would say it sort of doesn't align, and this is sort of a subjective viewpoint on it, is they have told you that the backup quarterback is a very important position because it's a guy that not only, do you want to develop, but has to be able to get in there and win games for you the way Nick Foles did. A couple of years ago, Gardner Minshew stepped in and won a game against the Jets, played pretty well. The year after, he started 2 games, did not win them. I think the Saints game was really rough for him. The Cowboys game, not so much. They just lost a shootout in that game. The last 2 years, I think it's fair to say, though, can you sit there and feel really confident that if Jalen Hurts misses 3 games, that you felt that Mariota and now Kenny Pickett can go in there and go 2-2, 3-1 in those 4 games? It's definitely fair to question that because both Mariota and Pickett come to the Eagles at a time where they did not play very good football the year before.
You mentioned about that playing well. I want to ask you about that because, I know it's not an apples-to-apples comparison, but I kind of look at Pickett in Pittsburgh as a guy who was not always put in a position to be successful because between Matt Canada, the offense coordinator, and then, his quote-unquote mentor was Mitch Trubisky of all people. It's like you're putting a guy in a situation where maybe he's not in a position to be successful. Maybe if Pickett went to the Steelers and they had a legitimate veteran there, maybe he could actually have had time to develop into something. And now you're taking him from an environment with a bunch of guys who are fighting for their professional survival to an environment where you're not asking him to have to fight for his own survival. Maybe he can develop into something.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Josh. I think when I watched Kenny Pickett at Pitt and spoke to people about him, there were people who thought he had good talent. Maybe not where the Steelers drafted him, but a lot of times when you're a quarterback drafted in the first round, you don't even have a first-round grade. It's just that they feel with 2 or 3 good years of development, you can be a quarterback who can win games for you in the league. There were times where Kenny Pickett flashed and showed you what he can be. They just weren't consistent enough. And I agree that he sort of had the perfect storm of defensive head coach, bad offensive coordinator, bad offensive line. And of all 3 of those, the offensive line, I think, really hurt him the most. They drafted a tackle out of Georgia last year who didn't get on the field until about the middle of the year. And I think Pickett had already been hurt. And Broderick Jones, I want to say, I thought he played fairly decent and gave that line a lift. And they started to run the ball way better over the second half of the year. But by then, Pickett had already been hurt. Mason Rudolph came in, did some nice things. He stayed in. I don't feel like Pickett actually got the benefit of they changed coordinators. Then they started Broderick Jones. Then they started to run the ball better. We never really saw Pickett in that environment. And I'm not trying to make excuses for him, but he definitely had the look of somebody to me who was playing scared, getting out of the pocket early, bailing, trying to throw the ball so he wouldn't get hit instead of a guy who felt confident that he would have the time to make the throws he wanted to make.
Talking with Geoff Mosher from the Inside the Birds podcast, InsideTheBirds.com, here on Football at 4 on 97.3 ESPN. Josh Henning filling in for Mike Gill on a Monday afternoon. I did chuckle, though, when they added Will Greer this weekend because it's like now you got another guy who's going to give the Eagles an excuse not to play Jalen Hurts in the preseason, right, Geoff?
Exactly it. Now, usually, as we said on the podcast, usually when you see a fourth quarterback or a team that carries four quarterbacks is not uncommon, especially into OTAs. But usually that guy is kind of another developmental guy, young guy. It's not often that it's someone who's been at least in and around the league for a few years, like Will Greer, who I think was a rookie with the Panthers in 2019, I want to say. So you're looking about 3 or 4 years that he's already been in and around the league. But he has familiarity with Kellen Moore. He was with them last year, the Chargers. So therefore, he was also with the new quarterbacks coach, Doug Nussmeier, who was QB's coach under Kellen Moore in L.A. and also in Dallas. So I get it. Chip Kelly sort of infamously did this when he became Eagles head coach by bringing in Dennis Dixon, who played for him at Oregon. And everybody thought, Chip's bringing his guy in. He's going to start Dennis Dixon. And no, he wound up re-signing Michael Vick, and Nick Foles was there. And, when it was time to play real football, Dennis Dixon was not even on the 53-man roster.
Right.
So we've seen this before, and I from what we're told, this is similar. It's just it has no reflection on how they feel about Tanner McKee. They want to give that kid a chance to compete and see what he can do. But you need a fourth guy, and this fourth guy just happens to know the scheme and can help out in that regard.
Geoff, you mentioned Kellen Moore. I want to ask you about that because I know we've talked a lot about whether it's here on 97.3 or you guys on the Inside the Birds podcast about, what does Kellen Moore mean for what the offense will look like on the field? What is your take on Kellen Moore's influence on how things are developing off the field? Because I got to think that some of these decisions that have been made, the bringing in the Devontae Parkers, the trading for Kenny Pickett's, the signing Saquon Barkley, I got to assume that there's got to be some Kellen Moore, maybe not direct influence, but maybe some sort of how much do you think him being here has maybe changed some of what the Eagles are doing this offseason versus the past offseasons?
I know that there's some dots connected there, Josh, because the Eagles have made some uncharacteristic moves this offseason. And so you look at the new coordinators and maybe there's a dot to connect there that, there's probably a lot more influence from these two coordinators than in the past. But I haven't heard that, and I'm reluctant to draw any parallels to it, to be honest with you. I just think that the Eagles have always been run with what Howie Roseman has in mind. Does he take input in? Does he recognize who his coordinators are and try to marry personnel with scheme? Yeah, absolutely. No question. Will Greer, good example. We just talked about that. But I don't look at the Saquon Barkley signing and think that doesn't happen if Brian Johnson is the coordinator or if Cliff Kingsbury is the coordinator. It's always been a Howie Roseman operation with a degree of input from coaches and coordinators, but I really don't have any information that tells me that because Vic Fangio is the defensive coordinator or because Kellen Moore is the offensive coordinator, that's why you're seeing these moves. In fact, I know that that's a popular kind of assumption. I don't know how you would make that assumption and then say Devin White makes sense for the Eagles because he really, outside of his ability to maybe run with the three, carry the three in zone defense, I'm not sure there's a whole lot of Devin White's game that is synonymous with what Vic Fangio does defensively. He certainly doesn't blitz linebackers a lot. So I really don't make that parallel.
You mentioned about not making the parallel, but if I could just play devil's advocate for a moment. So for you, you mentioned Devin White, right? Why do you then think Devin White is here? Do you think the Eagles, is this a situation where, Howie says about Kenny Pickett, hey, we evaluated this guy well in the draft? Or could it possibly be that Devin White is the guy that Vic Fangio and says, give me that guy, I'll be the coach to do X, Y, Z with him?
No, I think Devin White is with the Eagles because he, is a linebacker and the Eagles needed one. He was probably one of the best ones left, even though he's coming off 2 disappointing years. At that point that they signed him, it wasn't like there were a bunch of really, really good linebackers left. So, A, they needed a starting linebacker. He was one of the few on the board that had as much starting experience as he did. B, they could get him on a 1-year cost-efficient deal. C, we know how much priority the Eagles placed on analytics, and if there's one box Devin White's going to check off better than almost anybody out there, including guys who signed before him, was that he's a superior athlete. Mm-hmm. He's Mr. Underwear Olympics. I'm not trying to be, degrading. I mean, he is an unbelievable athlete. And that's why, and the Eagles know that they are not going to draft a linebacker in the first round, and they may not draft a linebacker in the second round. Because if you draft a linebacker in the second round, you got to kind of get that guy on the field immediately, right? And the Eagles want to get other guys on the field, offensive line, defensive line, pass rushers, cornerbacks perhaps. So they needed to draft-proof themselves at that position. And by getting a starting linebacker of Devin White ability or credentials, and then also going and getting Oren Burks to pair with Nakobe Dean, and then you also have Zach Baldwin and Ben Van Sumeren, they don't have to take a linebacker early. It'd be nice if they once in a while did, but they don't have to. So that's why I feel Devin White is a linebacker for the Eagles more so than Vic Fangio saying, get me Devin White.
Okay, that's interesting. Geoff Mosher from the Inside the Birds podcast, InsideTheBirds.com, at Geoff P. Mosher on Twitter. You use the term draft-proof themselves. So not to overly read into what you're saying. I'm not trying to project anything there, but I am curious. When you talk about draft-proofing themselves, so like, for example, they haven't added a bunch of cornerbacks or safeties so far in free agency. Is that a position that maybe they feel more comfortable with going into the draft versus linebacker, let's say?
No, because the signing period is still young, as we know, right? I mean, you have an opportunity to improve your team outside of the draft in free agency or the trade market from now until the day before the first game of the season. And we have seen the Eagles use late free agency, late trade market quite a bit to improve their team. So I don't see their inaction, is what you're asking, at safety other than C.J. Gardner-Johnson in that corner right now as a sign that they're very comfortable there or that they feel they can just draft a starter there. That's not what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that there's just more time. It's a buyer's market at some of those positions that we just talked about, especially safety.
Now, with that being said, so we're talking about the drafts here for a moment, Geoff. I want to ask you, because in recent years, the Eagles have leaned more into the best player available idea, right? They've leaned more into, this is the guy highest on our board, we have to draft this guy. Is that going to continue to be the philosophy you believe moving forward?
Well, as it's always put to me, the Eagles aren't necessarily best player available. They're more best player available at the position that they value. The Ravens are best player available. Go look at their draft history. They've drafted a center. They've drafted a safety. They've drafted a wide receiver in the first round. They've drafted an offensive lineman in the first round. They have drafted literally a linebacker, right, Patrick Queen. They have drafted every position that's there, except for maybe kicker and punter, right, and long snapper. So that's a team that truly believes in best available player. The Eagles, as we very much know, are not going to draft a linebacker in the first round, not going to draft a safety, not going to draft a tight end in the first round. They're going to draft an offensive lineman, a defensive lineman, a quarterback, and I do believe, even though it's been 22 years, that they do believe quarterback is still a value position for them. It just hasn't worked in their favor. A couple of years ago, they would have drafted Patrick Surtain. He got taken by Denver. They took Devontae Smith, which, they were like neck and neck on the board, as I was told and understood it. So that position I would put on the table as well. But that's the 4 positions: O-line, D-line, cornerback, and what did I say? Cornerback and and quarterback, obviously, and wide receiver. Those would be the positions that they value.
All right, Geoff, before I let you go, because your Twitter handle is Geoff P. Mosher on Twitter. I got to know because we know the P actually stands for Phillies. I say that obviously tongue in cheek. Jake Cave gone. Cody Clemens sent to the minor leagues. Is Geoff Mosher okay if the starting outfield is Rojas in center and Brandon Marsh on left on opening day?
Yes, I'm okay with that. Look, I think that with Rojas, my concern was I felt he needed at bats. So I thought it would be all right to send him out AAA where he can play every day. But I was okay with him coming up north as long as they are committed to playing him for a month or two and letting him get the bat going if it's there. Like, if he goes like 2 for 12 in the opening series, right, against the Braves, like, I can't have him now being a part-time player platooning with Pache. Like, you either give him the chance to AAA, give him the chance to the majors, and make it a real chance. Because I think the Phillies can afford to have a light-hitting guy in their ninth hole to get that kind of defense they get from Rojas. But they've got to commit to playing him almost every day, you know, in my mind. Or else, what are you doing here? And, yeah, I'm happy to see that Jake Cave is not on the Phillies roster. I think, you know, I would have liked to see Clemens just to get another left-handed at-bat, even though I'm not really a Cody Clemens guy. But right now, your only left-handed guy on the bench, I think, is Garrett Stubbs, which is
Correct.
a little concerning. But look, if you got Rojas in center and Marsh in left, I think you got great outfield defense from maybe the first time since sort of at the end of last year, right? And I'm all right with that.
Yeah, see, my only concern is I wanted Clemens because I think he's a better first base option than either Merrifield or Sosa over there. I felt like I was more comfortable with him being on the roster because, I mean, Pache only plays outfield. Merrifield, I don't think Merrifield's ever played first base in his life.
No, I don't believe he has. So I definitely understand that. I kind of thought Clemens was going to make it. And I've never really been a Clemens guy, even when he was hitting the ball well. I just, you know, I always goes back to he was a throw-in in that trade. He didn't really perform well in the minors before he came to the Phillies. But you know what? I can't complain with what he's done since he's been a Philly, and I thought maybe he would make it up there as well.
Yeah, he's also a good emergency pitcher if you need a guy to come in like a 15-1 blowout.
Yeah, he is. You always need that to be faced. He just channels his inner dad, right? His rocket. He says, "I can do this just like my pop did."
Well, I think he had 4 outings last year coming out of the bullpen. So it's like it's not like he can't do it.
Well, the question I always wondered is it because he's Roger Clemens' kid, or is it just happen to be you're the super utility guy, so you're gonna have to pitch in the mop up there in the blowout games?
Well, here's the other side of the question: is when the opposing hitter sees Cody Clemens on the mound, do they worry that he's Roger Clemens' kid?
I'm gonna guess that they don't.
Okay. That was a reach.
If Mike Piazza ever had a kid who played in the majors, then maybe. But, you know, that's a whole different story.
Geoff Mosher from the Inside the Birds podcast, InsideTheBirds.com. You can hear more ramblings from him on the Powder Blue podcast about the Phillies. Yeah, it was 4 outings he had for the Phillies last year. He came into 4 games, pitched in 2 2/3 innings, and only gave up 1 run, Jeff. 1 run in 2 2/3 innings.
Well, we'll just call him Baby Rocket.
Baby Rocket. I don't know if I'll call him that because he had 3 walks also in those 2 2/3 innings. So
the Baby Wild Rocket.
Baby Wild Rocket. Jeff, always appreciate the conversation. Take care, my friend.
All right, Josh. Take care.